Bobby Kennedy now is Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services. He will control $1.7 trillion. The US spends more money on healthcare than any other nation in the world. If you look at any normal metric of how well a health service is going, America's not doing well.
6.5 pounds, it is massive.
There are 116 million overweight people in the U.S., many of them putting their health in danger.
The very things that we use to try and, sustain ourselves, the food, is killing us slowly. And the drugs that we take to try and deal with those problems are killing us even more quickly. So, Houston, there's a problem.
The global health system is broken, and it's no accident. From corporate control over medicine to the suppression of natural remedies, the very institutions that are meant to protect public health are failing us. But could Robert Kennedy Jr.'s appointment as Secretary of Health and Human Services be a turning point? Today, I'm joined by Dr. Rob Verkerk, a scientist, health activist, and founder of the Alliance for Natural Health, to break down what this moment could mean for medical freedom, holistic health, and the fight against corruption in healthcare. Here's what's coming up. Bobby Kennedy's appointment, is it a real chance for reform or just another challenge to the system? Why people are sicker than ever, despite the US spending more money on healthcare than ever before in its history, and what we can do now to take back control of our health. This is a powerful, eye-opening conversation about how this moment represents a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for the future of holistic health and medical freedom. But before we dive in, a quick message. If you love these conversations and want to go deeper, please join our Live Free and Prosper membership community, where you'll get ad-free episodes, behind-the-scenes content, and have the opportunity to join the conversation amongst our community of free thinkers. Join us now at danastingregory.com/supporter. And now let's get into the conversation with Dr. Rob Verkerk. Rob, literally minutes before we were due to record this podcast, we got word that Bobby Kennedy, RFK Jr, has been appointed into his position. What a time to be alive. What does this all mean to you?
My goodness. By the skin of his teeth, we knew it would be close, but Bobby Kennedy now is going to be, without doubt, Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services. That puts him in a very unique position. He will control $1.7 trillion. That's about 25% of the US federal budget. And the reality is that most of that money, huge amounts of that money, have been wasted. Because if you look at any normal metric of how well a health service is going, America's not doing well. I mean, it doesn't take anyone very long to find out that there is an obesity problem, a metabolic disease problem there. If you look in terms of life expectancy, the US is sitting currently 49th in the global rankings. If you look at a much more important metric, which is looking at healthy years of life expectancy, it's sitting at 80th in the world.
Wow.
And yet the US spends more money on healthcare than any other nation in the world. So currently spending close to $12,000 per person per capita for every single person. And there are a whole rash of countries, Tunisia, Algeria, Venezuela. These are countries who spend less than $1,000 but have longer healthy life expectancy than Americans. So something is really wrong with the health system. It isn't about throwing more money about it. It's doing things in a different way. It does raise some incredibly interesting specters because, at one level, he's basically saying, let's get all these PFAS, forever chemicals out. Trump is doing deals with chemical companies and drug companies. So there's going to be tension.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not going to be straightforward. But he's a friend. It really, we cannot think of another occasion when there has been someone who is completely sympathetic with all of our issues, who is in a place not just of high government, but in the most powerful seat in government related to health anywhere in the world. So that's a unique event, and exactly how it pans out is anyone's guess. But Jonathan E. Maud, our general counsel, who's also known as the FDA Dragon Slayer, because he's the most successful attorney in challenging the FDA, and he's done it 6 times on behalf of our organization, Alliance for Natural Health. He's done it 14 times in total. But he was invited to be chief counsel for the FDA, and it took him a millisecond to say, sorry, guys, no. He worked inside the Reagan administration in the Federal Communications Commission, and he said, never again. You know, essentially what people like Bobby Kennedy need is people like us on the outside who can help work against this massive bureaucracy that he's going to be dealing with. So he will be blocked at every turn because he's going to be doing the kind of things that Tulsi Gabbard is going to be doing, that Kash Patel probably, if he gets in, will be doing, which is essentially disrupting, turning the system upside down, exposing the corruption. You know, sunlight is the best disinfectant, and there'll be plenty of that going on. And that's the reason that Pfizer and the rest of them have been burning files and getting rid of stuff and hiding data, because it's all going to, you know, come out into the open. And you have to deal with that corruption, and you have to create transparency. The three things that are central to what Bobby Kennedy is doing, you know, with the MAHA agenda, and Jonathan and I have written a book about this, are really dealing with the corruption, so ending corruption. Second is creating transparency and redefining how you do science and medicine and what criteria you use. This is what we used to call evidence-based medicine, but unfortunately it became another pay-to-play system that got manipulated for the benefit of special interests, particularly the pharmaceutical industry. But now there's almost no separation between big pharma, big food, big government. So the whole lot is now being overturned. I think many of us realize that you can't necessarily give, you can't predict what the Trump administration itself is going to do. Donald Trump himself is quite an unpredictable character. You know, you can see even in this vote that's just gone through now, Mitch McConnell has, as a Republican, voted against RFK, and he's done that because he's very, very unhappy. And there is a bit of a battle going between traditional Republicans and, if you like, this new breed of Republicans that are really trying to change the order of things, if you like, you know, upsetting this pattern that has been shifting us ever more towards corporate control, towards globalism, and to say, look, we got to pull stuff back. We got to deal not only with national sovereignty, but we got to deal with individual sovereignty. And that's why, you know, health comes before wealth. You know, if you don't have health, and this is what Trump sees. One of the reasons he wants Bobby Kennedy in there is not just because he knows how to identify corruption and expose it. He's also got a big picture view on how you create healthy people. And Trump knows exactly what's happening with the statistics. And you cannot have a strong economy if you have weak, overweight, diseased, cancer-ridden, heart disease-ridden people. Absolutely. Which is currently how you can define American people. So a truly tumultuous time, not just for America, but actually for the world, because this is going to have a drip feed effect all over the world. I mean, the world's eyes are on what's happening in the Senate right now.
Absolutely. I mean, there's this old phrase that if America catches a cold, the rest of the world, or if America sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold. Well, hopefully now, if America gets healthy, the rest of the world will follow suit on that basis, because this is groundbreaking. I'm already in the last couple of weeks, there's been this controversial lid lifting with the US aid and looking at the misallocation and misappropriation of funds. I mean, we're looking at a much larger budget here now. So when the scrutiny comes on where the money has gone, let alone where it could go, I think there's going to it's going to be madness. But again, the controversy comes because the established order is trying to protect itself.
See, these issues have been known by many of us for a long, long time. When I was working in East Africa and Southern Africa on aid programs, it was very well known that, particularly when it comes to US aid, for every dollar, this was going back into the 1990s, for every dollar that's spent on US aid, another $10 comes back to the US. So that was just the pattern that everyone got used to. People were feeding the beast all the time. And now there's a group of people, and of course, Musk has been a big part of that, setting up Doge to be able to do that. And obviously, you've seen every possible tactic in the book being used to prevent Donald Trump becoming president, stopping Doge being set up by Elon Musk. But it's happening, it's unstoppable, it's viewed as a populist movement. Now that's one I find intriguing, by the way, because now populism is seen as a bad thing, whereas I come from a world where if you've got a lot of people who like something, you start moving towards what we used to think of as a truly democratic society, who
Yes.
putting people into power to execute the people's will. And so, look, I mean, our perspective is really focused on the health side. And of course, in dealing with the health side, you have to deal with the politics of health. So corrupt bodies, that this corporatocracy, which is essentially a fascist system where there is almost no separation between corporate power and big government power. So to slice down the size of government, to remove the bureaucracy. I mean, one of the reasons that I'm heading up our US nonprofit is in Europe, we've been battling with the EU system. There are some really broken elements of this that essentially use risk adversity to control people. And obviously we saw this to a massive degree during COVID. But you notice everything is done, whether it's one of the reasons Europe has done very well with reducing our exposure to chemicals is because people are very risk averse. So you go into a gas station in Europe and you see Haribo confectionery that are fed to children who are traveling down motorways for some reason. And you check I mean, it's a hobby of mine, okay? So you check the ingredients there. You look at exactly the same Haribo selling in the US, and it's not just red dye 3 that Bobby Kennedy's actions have forced the US government now to withdraw, the FDA to say, oh, it's a carcinogen, we've got to pull it. There's a whole bunch of other stuff in there. There's, all these preservatives like sodium benzoate that reacts with vitamin C that produces carcinogens. But there's a whole host. So these kids are being exposed to this complete plethora of nastiness that is associated with long-term disease. And each one of these compounds has been studied in isolation. Many of them are risky. So in Europe, they use the precautionary principle. If there is scientific uncertainty, well, let's pull it off the market, especially if there's something else. In the US, that hasn't been the pattern, but that thinking is now coming in. So we're starting to see it work not so much on toxins, but we're seeing it working against things that are good for us that compete with drugs. And these things are often called nutrients or botanicals, plant compounds that have all sorts of wonderful effects. But hey, they compete with drugs. So we've just seen, for example, over 25 peptides. These are, most hormones are peptides. These are really important signaling molecules used by human beings and all other animals to be able to control pretty much every process in the body. They act as gene switches, they act as hormones, they lock onto receptor sites to create appropriate signaling in appropriate conditions. So really important to keep us healthy. And a lot of these peptides have been made by compounding pharmacies in the US. They compete with Big Pharma's products. And essentially the FDA has come along and said, sorry, guys, we're going to put a whole bunch of these on the naughty list, which is basically said you can't use them for compounding. And the reason is precautionary thinking. It's come from Europe. They say, because we have a safety concern, they may be immunogenic, they may be toxic to the immune system, but they don't specify a dose. And there's missing data. So they use this European idea that the lack of evidence is evidence of lack of safety, which is, frankly, scientific bullshit.
Okay.
So yeah, that's what's happening. Bobby Kennedy he knows all of these things. We've already put a lot of strategies into the transition team. I mean, we're planning, because we have the Rottweiler of the FDA in the form of Jonathan Emord centrally in our team now. Mm-hmm. And Jonathan and Melanie, who and I have just come off a 3-week tour through Utah, Florida, and then finishing in the Senate. So we had a big briefing in the Senate a couple of weeks ago on behalf of Bobby Kennedy, and we launched our book. We got our book, the MAHA mandate, into every senator's office.
Incredible.
We had 8 meetings with key senators on top of that. So, this is a once in a lifetime opportunity to have someone who understands these issues, understands the interplay of corruption, understands that real health is always multifactorial. There's never going to be a single drug, a single pill, you know, a single surgical procedure that can solve complex diseases. The diseases we essentially suffer from today are diseases of maladaptation to the modern environment. And you can't change the environment very easily, but we can change the way we interact with our health ecosystem. And that means you need to do lots of things. So, yeah, it's going to be amazing having Bobby Kennedy in place.
There's a lot of hope, Rob. There's a lot of hope. But there's also a lot of skepticism about his ability to actually break through what some refer to as the deep state and the deep mechanisms that are incumbent within the system. Some even worry about some of the policies that Trump himself might put forward that will override what Bobby is doing. What do you see as some of the biggest constraints to his ability to...
It's quite interesting that the critics have been very, very limited in their attacks. They are still using the anti-vaxxer attack. I mean, the primary attacks have been twofold. One is to go after him as being an anti-vaxxer. He said, by the way, I vaccinated all my children. I had a definite problem with the HPV vaccine. In fact, I sued on it. And of course, then they said, that's the other problem. He could be a beneficiary of the lawsuit that he's launched against HPV. And now he's turned around and said, sorry, guys, I'm not going to take any of that money. So that dealt with that. The other issue is, does he have, in general, a problem with vaccines? And, obviously people looking at Children's Health Defense, which is the NGO that he used to head up, that we've worked very closely with over many years as well. And of course, they have had an issue over the way in which the vaccine schedule has increased. And for some reason, people have a certain understanding of when he says that there's all these nasty things going into school lunches and these nasty chemicals that we're being exposed to all the time, that is somehow different from a whole bunch of nasty chemicals and other agents that bypass the gastrointestinal tract, which is one of the most, intelligent systems that discriminates between friend and foe, is injected through the skin and goes straight into the bloodstream. And somehow what they've managed to do, and particularly they've catalyzed that process over the last 5 years through COVID, is to suggest that any criticism of vaccines, without exception, is a taboo. So they've created a taboo out of this. Yep. And the ability to have any real rational, intelligent discussion. And that is all that Kennedy is asking for. He's saying, look, I'm not anti-vax, I'm pro-choice. And I'm particularly pro-informed choice. So if you don't have information, how can you ever have informed choice? In fact, you basically sabotage one of the fundamental principles of medical ethics, which is informed consent. You also, if you push towards mandates, which of course, in the event of another pandemic, which we're all being told we better get used to, it's going to happen soon, it's going to be way worse than the last one, mandates could be a reality. And this is why there's also some major concerns by opponents over the positioning of Jay Bhattacharya, who was one of the authors of the Great Barrington Declaration, who's going to be heading up NIH, which controls, I think they're going to be controlling about $47 billion worth of funding. And hey, wouldn't it be amazing if they started to use NIH funding to really look at the impact of the vaccine schedule? Because just like these chemicals, they're all studied in isolation, but that doesn't happen to a child. They get absolutely, shot to pieces with a huge number of injections at the same time. And we've got to have some understanding. And of course, Donald Trump has been criticized for commenting on autism. And of course, another taboo that's being created is this possibility that there might be a relationship between the vaccine schedule and the development of autism. And everyone knows pretty much since the late 80s, there's been a skyrocketing increase in autism rates in children. Some of that is due to additional reporting, but it certainly cannot be all of it. So what is going on in the environment that is creating that? and it's likely to be very much multifactorial. But can you justify eliminating the possibility that vaccines aren't part of that issue when we're dealing with, on average, in most developed countries now, autism rates going up to 1 in 40? So just from an economic standpoint, we cannot sustain a functioning economy with that number of people, because it's not just the kids who get autism, it's the impact on the families and the social systems that then need to support them through that. So these are really big issues, and Bobby Kennedy wants to be able to deal with those.
Given that we're talking about health today, I want to take a moment to talk about a brand that's been an absolute game changer for me when it comes to supporting my health naturally. Introducing Adaptogenic Apothecary. I've personally been using their products for months now, and I can honestly say that they have made a real difference in my well-being, my energy, my overall health. Their adaptogenic blends help manage stress, boost energy, and improve mental clarity, making it easier to stay focused and calm throughout my day. I especially love Power, which helps with energy and athletic performance, and Calm, which is my go-to for stress relief and improving my sleep. These products are packed with medicinal mushrooms, adaptogens, and Afron, which are all proven to help support the body's natural rhythms and to restore balance. But what really sets Adaptogenic Apothecary apart is their focus on hormonal health for women. The founders, Jody and Paris, started this journey after experiencing shifts in their bodies post-40, sleepless nights, brain fog, irritability, and they turned to plant-based medicine for relief. That's when they created Harmony, a powerful supplement designed to support each phase of the menstrual cycle. With ingredients like Afron, medicinal mushrooms, and adaptogens, these blends help women to stay balanced, energized, all naturally, of course. And if you want to optimize your health and experience the benefits of these products yourself, you can get 10% off your first order by using discount code DAG, that's DAG, all in capitals, at adaptogenicapothecary.com, and give them a try. You'll find the link below. I highly recommend these products for anyone looking to boost their health naturally and to feel more balanced every single day. Now back to the show.
Do you think he'll be able to take the kind of hard line that he took with Children's Health Defence? Would he be able to take that energy and that commitment into his current role? Do you think he will face challenges?
I don't think he will. I don't think he will.
Right.
So again, it's one of the reasons we're very keen to stay on the outside and be a watchdog to all of that. That there's a number of compromises that he has had to make. So if you look at the compromise he made with Cassidy in the Senate over, Cassidy is the doctor in the finance committee who is very influential, and of course, and we've published stories on our website that show the amount that senators have been paid by the pharmaceutical industry. So it's not as if it's a clean vote that's been going on, but essentially he did a deal with Cassidy to vouch for the fact that he would not take an anti-vaccine stance, but actually he's never said he would. He would take a pro-choice and a pro-informed choice approach around transparency. So he won't be able to take the same kind of militant approach into government, because that's not the job of government. The job of government is to do the right thing, whereas the job of a non-profit campaign organization like Children's Health Defence is to grab not only the branches of the tree, but the trunk of the tree and shake it as hard as you can and see what stands up to scrutiny. So I think he will welcome organizations like ours, organizations like CHD. We've got a very, very good relationship with Mary Holland, who now heads it up, who's also a lawyer, who's worked very, very closely with Bobby. And we know that he's going to be welcoming us taking a hard line against any policy that doesn't work in the best interest of the health of American people.
And when you've had the kind of level of principles that he's had and the level of focus on such an issue, it's hard to imagine that you could drop those no matter what commitment he's made. But I also can see the machinery getting in the way of the kind of work that he was doing with the CHD. I mean, he's encountered it from the outside, and he's going to encounter it 10x from the inside.
Exactly. So you see, if you look back at the man, you know, he's been a naughty boy at different times in his life, and obviously the Kennedy bloodline is a pretty interesting place to emerge from. But he's had a major addiction problem in his younger years. But if you look at the problem with addiction in America, it is out of control. So, Trump was ridiculed for initially drawing attention to the problem with fentanyl coming across from the Mexican cartels into the US. And now everyone's accepted that actually that is a major problem. But it's not just fentanyl. If you look what's happening with prescription opioids, I mean, the settlements now have basically, I think they've hit the $50 billion mark. These are the settlements that had to be made because the opioid companies selling legal prescription opioids were exaggerating the benefits. They were massively underestimating the risk and the addictive side effects. And people were taking these things like Smarties, and doctors were prescribing them and being paid to prescribe them. So they've created an addiction problem in the American people. And there is very little separation between that problem, because of the way in which it works through reward pathways and opioid receptors in the brain, and the addiction that American people have for sugar. Mm. And one of the things that Mel and I have noticed over the last 20 years, going backwards and forwards to America all the time, since there's been this slight reduction in the amount of sugar in pre-packaged foods, the amount of sugar that's now going into, say, restaurant foods, I mean, you can't buy a salad without kind of being shocked at the amount of sugar in every single dressing. And then they'll put nuts on the salad, but those are candied nuts. I mean, surrounded by sugar coating. I mean, it's inedible from a European palate point of view. So the amount of added sugars, these are all just sugars that are, touching on the reward pathways in the brain, and because people have become addicts. And if you look at the scale of prescription drug addiction and recreational drug addiction, it's the third or fourth leading cause of ill health in the United States. Prescription drugs are actually the third leading cause of death in the United States. So the very things that we use to try and, sustain ourselves, the food is killing us slowly, and the drugs that we take to try and deal with those problems are killing us even more quickly. So, Houston, there's a problem.
Yeah. Rob, in less than 25 minutes, you've outlined some massive systemic level issues, some cultural issues, societal issues, all of which radically harm our health. And it's unsurprising that America finds itself in the position it's in right now. You've been on tour in the US, you've taken your book out there. I'd love to hear more about that in a moment. And I'm sure the book speaks into this point. But with all these problems, if you were advising Bobby stepping into his role now, what would be the number one priority? What would be the top three priorities that you think is most important to deal with?
Well, I think he's got them. He's got them as central part of his mandate. In fact, Trump gave him these three things to do. One is end corruption, which is slightly easier said than done. But you've got to start exposing and turning it over, shine that sunlight on it. You've got to create transparency in the way that science is done. So, if you look at this idea, this misconception about science being something that can only be done by, Nobel laureates or people who are paid very large amounts of money in leading universities, and you not realize that this science is controlled. So this notion that we must follow the science is not true science, because you can't have true science unless you respect fundamentally the scientific method, which has actually been around for thousands of years. Get a hypothesis, run an experiment to test that hypothesis, publish how you do that so others can duplicate it. Then you see differing results. What do you need? Discourse. And with discourse, you end up having some kind of debate over what seems to make sense, what approaches this notion of scientific truth, which is really a subjective notion in itself. And then eventually we reach this point of having scientific consensus. Now, that entire system has been blown apart, systematically blown apart. And this idea of scientific misinformation becoming anyone who contests a given narrative, something that really became apparent in the follow the science process that occurred during COVID, is a total bastardization of science. I mean, and so Kennedy, as a second element to the MAHA agenda, is going to be dealing with that. So he's moving from this notion of evidence-based medicine, which has now been controlled. It's a kind of pay-to-play system that they've created. Drug licensing. I mean, think about it. You pay for a license. It might cost you a couple of billion to get a pharmaceutical drug into market. And you can tell people it's safe and effective, even when it's neither safe, because check out the contraindications and the side effects and adverse reactions. It's absolutely not safe. These things are shown. Peter Gotcha, the co-founder of the Cochrane collaboration, has demonstrated these prescription drugs used properly are the third leading cause of death, both in the United States and in Europe. So, you know, and to say that they're effective is entirely crazy. You know, you've had back in 2003 a very leading. It was the head of one of the pharmacology units that was dealing with pharmacogenomics, Alan Roses, who said, you know, most drugs work only, 30% of the time in 30% of the population. So BMJ clinical evidence, they had to stop with looking at 3,000 different treatments, showing that on average, the evidence of benefit was only around about 10% of all treatments. So they're not clearly effective on most people most of the time. So what we need to move to is a new paradigm, and Bobby Kennedy has already started to make the right noises in this area, to something called outcome-based medicine. So what we want is results. And you only have to look at the American population and say, guys, we have a problem with the results, because even though oncologic drugs, anti-cancer drugs and anti-diabetic drugs and anti-heart disease drugs, main categories of drugs, these things are failing spectacularly. Why? Because these are still the three main reasons why people are dying. So, people don't die because of insufficient drugs. They definitely do die from too many drugs. But what they die from is the kind of foods that they eat. But it's not just what they eat, it's how they eat, it's when they eat. So we've got to break down this issue of food. And what are the components in that diet? Even if we look at a plant food like a broccoli, that we look at this, caricature of the healthiest food we can eat, depending on how we grow it and when we harvest it and what kind of soil it's grown in, it actually makes a great deal of difference to the chemical components within that food. I happen to do my PhD in that area, so I know quite a bit about brassica vegetables. Yes. But it makes a huge amount of difference how you grow it. And there's been this slow reduction in the healthy components within our foods that we eat. And many times this is because a lot of these ingredients in our plant foods are bitter. So you imagine if you're a plant breeder, you go, hey, we're going to find a way of getting kids to eat the spinach or eat the kale. So they produce a cultivar that has fewer of these bitterness factors. Now, these bitterness factors, guess what they do? They act as secondary plant compounds that act as pesticides to stop the bugs eating it. And when humans eat that same food, they're cancer protective, they're heart disease protective. So we are simplifying the foodstuffs that we're eating. We're eating more and more processed and ultra processed foods. One of the reasons that big food is now doing a massive attack on those of us who are shining a light on ultra processed foods is because that's how they're making their money. People are not cooking at home. If there's one thing that people can do to stay healthy, is buy whole foods and cook them at home. Understand what oils and what fats you're using. That will transform the health of any household. But of course, people are losing those skills rapidly. In Japan now, they're apartment blocks being built that don't even have kitchens because you just meant to go out and get your food. So yeah, we need to deal with the food, the air that we breathe, pretty toxic. If we can put lots of plants in our houses, we move in the right direction. But we need to deal with some of these toxins, and these toxins find our way into the drinking water. Bobby Kennedy has got his eyes on fluoride, fluoride that is put into the municipal water supplies is a byproduct of the fertilizer industry. It is not the same as the sodium fluoride you get in river waters. It is hydrofluorosilicic acid that acts in a very different way. It accumulates in the pineal gland, which is central not only to spiritual connection, but also to our entire endocrine hormonal function, and production of melatonin, for example. But it also, we've got very clear evidence that, if you consume too much fluoride, because you're medicating the water supply, in other words, you can't control dose very easily, you can create too much. So there's a major study that's been done in Ireland that shows very clearly that the dental fluorosis problem that kids who are drinking fluoridated water suffer from finds its way into the skeletal system, creates the same problem. So we get brittle bones as we get older. So, and it's related to cancer and a whole range of other. So he wants to get it out of the water supply. If you want to take fluoride, hey, you could take sodium fluoride tablets, and that can be your choice. But don't medicate the water supply and tell people that the water supply is now safe. So, there's so many ways in which we don't deal with stress well. People becoming ever more stress intolerant. The digital technology probably has a very, very significant impact. Again, NIH could be funding a lot more work in that area. I bet they will be with Bobby Kennedy in place, because it's one of the most, novel parts of the human experience that we are not pre-adapted to in any way. We need to be able to get space.
Comparatively under-researched as well.
Massively.
Everything we've talked about here, it's really fascinating how much of the conversation is dominated by the corporatization of health. Even the fact that in the US it's called the Food and Drug Administration. I mean, how does food and drugs end up in the same administration? One supposedly comes from nature, but it all becomes clear from everything you're talking about. We're not talking about natural whole foods. We're talking about ultra processed, effectively pharma foods with a P, not from your local, regenerative farm.
Yes.
So it feels like, in a way, there's a war not only on natural health, but on health itself. And you've got big industry, food, drugs, pharmaceuticals, tech, against common basic understanding of the principles of good health. Who's going to win that war?
Yeah. Look,
how does that war get won by nature?
There has been no interest. While a corporatocracy has been running the show for the last few decades, this system that we're dealing with now is around about 80 years old. It was formed post World War II. It's very much linked to the revolution in organic chemistry. As soon as we understood the chemistry of carbon, and there was an ability to patent new molecules that were different from those in nature. So take pharmaceuticals, for example. Around about 60% of all pharmaceutical drugs that are licensed have their origin in nature. However, how come they have so many so-called side effects, adverse effects, harms? Because they behave in a very different way once you've tweaked a few molecules. Same as peptides. You take natural peptides and you just make a very small change to one amino acid or the position of any other bonded compound, and the thing completely changes its function, and it can go from something that's beneficial to something that's extremely toxic. So this is what happens when we start playing with nature. We now live in a world where modern biotechnology is becoming the norm. So as we see a kind of major push against this problem with so-called overpopulation, with the destruction of the natural environment, which I am absolutely clear about in my own mind is a massive problem. It is underplayed by some. There is no doubt that there is a true free fall in species biodiversity around the planet. Now, the question is, how much of that's got to do just with the change in climate? And the evidence would suggest that, once again, it's multifactorial, and maybe the effect of climate is one of the least important factors. And of course, changes in species diversity have always happened, as has climate change. You know, we've moved between cycles of ice age, and obviously we have tectonic drift and plates moving around and continents changing temperature. That happens all the time. But what we're in a unique position now is the, if you like, the anthropogenic, the human-related impacts. And what we're doing to, say, farmland, in terms of the destruction of the microbial layer that's existed in the soils, to me, that's one of the most serious problems, because the ability for that terrestrial microflora to be able to balance all sorts of changes in gases and to be able to detoxify, you know, even excreta of animals, and be able to recycle that and create all these wonderful nutrient cycles. And then if we look at what's going on in the oceans, the acidification from CO2 is just one element of it. But the poisoning, the toxicity of the oceans, the dumping of spent nuclear fuels that are slowly leaking in, you know, deep trenches deep in the ocean. And I mean, these are massive problems. The UK is just, under this new government, making a decision to go ahead with opening more nuclear power plants. I mean, crazy when we haven't looked at the long-term implications of it. So yes, I think the war, what we have to do is understand how the planet works better, and we have to understand how human beings work better. And in the medicine world, I think what medical students are taught is just a tiny slice of the picture of what it is to be human. And we, you know, if you look at the world of biophysics, we realize that we are more energy, we are more water than anything else. You know, even the biochemical reactions, if we look at a human body through a biochemical lens, because we've been taught to do that, because the guys who control the power block have been involved in biochemistry. They're involved in organic chemistry. They produce chemical molecules that interact with receptor sites. So they're looking at everything through a molecular and biochemistry lens. If that's the only lens we use, that's all we see. But if you choose to look at human beings and life on this planet through a much broader lens, that we can do through the evolution of broader, you know, non-siloed science, and we bring biophysics together with quantum biology, quantum physics, electrochemistry, electrophysiology, and start putting this holistic picture together, you pretty much see that we kind of need a clean slate now, and we need to start changing dramatically the way we do healthcare. This idea of having medical doctors who are trained in a particular line of science and medicine, who largely become, you know, drug prescription machines. That's not working.
No.
Because there's a great study published in 2016 in the US that shows, studying county health rankings, and it basically shows that if you look at outcomes in human beings, only 16% of outcomes are related to clinical care.
Right.
The vast majority of outcomes that we experience, that we then go to the doctor from, are related to our interaction socially and environmentally, and what relates to our behavior. So these are the things. We have to change our behavior. We have to change the way we interact. We got to start sitting around dining room tables again, cooking at home, you know, chewing the cud, eating when we're in rest and digest mode, not in fight and flight mode, because we can't absorb nutrients. So we've got to reteach what it is to be human and how we should behave around each other if we are to be healthy. So the revolution has begun.
If you're tuning into this podcast, the chances are you're someone who thinks differently. You question the narratives, you want real freedom, and you're looking for unfiltered insights that can actually help you make sense of the world. But let's be real, social media is broken. Big tech controls what you can see, and independent voices are being suppressed more than ever. That's exactly why I created the Live Free and Prosper membership community, your private hub for uncensored conversations, exclusive deep dives, and direct access to a community of like-minded free thinkers. For just £5 a month, you get exclusive content that I can't share publicly, members-only Q&As, and the chance to connect with people who actually get it. So if you're serious about breaking free from the status quo and building a life on your own terms, then join us today. Just head to danastingregory.com/supporter or click the link in the description. That's danastingregory.com/supporter. I'll see you inside. Now, back to the show.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's so many fascinating things in there. I couldn't help internally chuckle to myself in agreement, but also just in how mad some things are. I think it is exciting that we can have this multidisciplinary scientific process that you talked about, bringing these kind of quantum sciences together. But it almost feels like the intersection of what, now quantum science is, or quantum physics is now validating when it comes to, say, the spiritual teachings that have been known for thousands of years. It almost feels like we're going to go through this massive scientific process just to validate what human beings have actually known for thousands of years about how to live healthily and a good life. It's just, all it will do is prove that everything we've done has distorted that reality, and we've moved further and further away from nature and natural processes. Technology has created new problems after new problem after new problem. So you get a drug that then you have another drug that solves the problem of the previous drug, and then an intervention that solves the problem that drug caused and that lifestyle factor caused. It feels like the scientific process is just going to go, oh, actually, nature, you were right all along.
Nature has true intelligence. And, in essence, what's happened is science has become a religion. But in that process, like some religions, they've become doctored, they've become altered in a way that suits certain interests, and they're less about the original intention. Science is just a tool that we use to understand things better. That is it. Yes. And so true science requires that you maintain a skeptical attitude. So this has been, we all saw it happening so blatantly during COVID. When we all wanted to be skeptics and say, guys, if you're going to produce a new technology platform for a vaccine, and then you're going to try and inject 90% of the population, there could be issues. Are we checking carefully? I mean, because we were outspoken about that process very early on, we got people who were subjects in the early Pfizer trials coming to us and saying, we've just had the most atrocious adverse event, and they're basically locking us out of the trial and not supporting our health or looking at, they're just removing us from the trial, and the doctors involved had nothing to do with it. They were just removed. End of story. So we knew there was something pretty shady going on right from the start. So that's not science.
No. As I was saying out loud about returning to nature, there was the devil's advocate in me. It said, yeah, there's this old parable about this overgrown garden and how this person moved into this wonderful house and he transformed the garden, and this local pastor comes and knocks on his door and says, I want to congratulate on what a beautiful job the Lord has done with your garden. And he says, well, thank you very much. And he said, well, you should have seen it when the Lord had it all to himself. But it kind of, similarly, I think the same argument can be made to be true. You could see what happened to when we just had nature, because science has helped us overcome some serious issues. But on the flip side, how much of that has happened at an expense of then losing our natural way and understanding that things that we may have done previously were contributing to disease, and our lack of understanding of sanitation or how to scale as a human population and dealing with those functions have been lost along the way when it comes to really understanding the true natural path to our own evolution.
But you see, what you've talked about is multiple ways in which science has been used. So if you look at the science around, say, sanitation, which has been one of the most remarkable areas of progress in public health, that was science.
True.
So we tend to use this one word, science,
to mean drugs,
to encompass everything to do with science. But within that whole, range of scientific, investigation and development and research, is a bunch of things that happen really, really well, and a bunch of things that weren't so good. It's the same as drugs. I mean, to say that all drugs are worthless is very unscientific based on the evidence. But to say that all drugs are safe and effective is equally unscientific.
Yeah.
So we've got to remember that science is no more than a tool, and we are babes in the wood when it comes to understanding how nature works. And we can't separate, a single species from the other 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 million other species that we share the planet with, because we have co-evolved alongside. We are more microbe than we are human. A healthy human has more microbial cells in it than human cells. So, we have this very, very complex interaction with our natural environment that we've co-evolved with over millennia. And I would say if there's going to be one reason that people are becoming so unhealthy, disconnection is it. Disconnection. So if we reconnect with each other, and we reconnect with nature, and we reconnect with the understanding that has come through the human experience, which goes back to time immemorial, it goes time back to the Vedic texts, and it goes time to understanding that we are metaphysical beings, that we live a multi-dimensional reality, that maybe, we're seeing some of this development in physics now, where there's a recognition that there may be parallel universes even. So we're at a very early stage of understanding things, and science is just a process that allows us to understand more of it. And if we look back in 1,000 years' times, we'll think, gee, these guys in 2025, they really didn't get it. They didn't get it. But the one thing that we have consistently seen is, if we rely on total disconnection from each other and from the natural world, we don't do very well. And there are a whole group of people on this planet who've been in extremely powerful places who really foresee a transhuman future. And that essentially is where I personally would draw the line, because a transhuman future is about essentially running off a cliff that you really don't know what's the other side of it, because you are essentially giving up on the things that we have spent millions of years adapting to, and saying, right, technology can outperform nature. And I think there's very little evidence of that. Even in areas, if we look at sort of aerodynamics and the development of more efficient airplanes, we see the people. I know a PhD student is working on that at the moment. When you learn the lessons of the birds, I mean, it's taken human beings a long time to realize, there's all these birds flying around. How come they look so different? They have wing shapes that are so different from airplanes, straight out like that. And as we start to copy and learn lessons from nature, we make things better and more efficient. So there's a big movement now that wants to get rid of agriculture, because you can take certain elements of data out of agricultural systems, high intensity, production systems, and go, that's bad. It's bad not just from an emissions point of view, it's bad from a soil point of view, but that doesn't represent all of agriculture. So, people like George Monbiot from The Guardian is now become a massive advocate of firming. He says, not a big problem. We're just going to move away from farming and go to firming, where we start to produce all our foods in these huge bioreactors, products of modern biotechnology. But guess what? Humans have never really eaten that kind of food. I mean, some of us may have eaten a bit of corn in our time, but we haven't lived off that. But if you buy into the problem of agriculture being one of the biggest problems with biodiversity, climate change, and everything else, you go, wow, let's just rewild farmland, let it go to nature, and we'll just eat food in a bioreactor. But once we do that, it's a little bit like the mRNA technology being foisted upon human beings. it is an experiment.
Well,
And
I mean, lab-grown meat is now just making its way into the supply chain without people even knowing. I mean, I was reading something the other day that there's some of the pet food has got lab-grown meat in, and it's not
test the animals first.
It's not necessarily abundantly disclosed. You know, it's the consumer. Well, the poor thing, can't even voice its opinion. Well, it might do. I don't know. Maybe if someone's dog has reacted violently to it. But the human food chain, the animal food chain. I mean, what do you make of lab-grown meat?
I am. You can see many articles we've written about it. I'm not a fan because, first of all, it was based on a false principle of what meat is. Meat isn't just protein.
It's not just cells.
No, it is. A very complex substrate that contains everything from hormones to nucleotides to signaling factors to peptides to very specific combinations of fats. So, one of the reasons people have now moved towards eating grass-fed meat, which is the meat that animals used to be reared on more on grasses rather than cereals, is because the fat balance, is the arachidonic acid levels in particular omega-6 fatty acid are much lower, and in the modern industrialized diet, we're eating way too many omega-6 fatty acids compared to omega-3 fatty acids. So that imbalance has pushed us into a pro-inflammatory condition. And that pro-inflammatory condition, that low systemic inflammatory state that we're all in, underpins all of the major diseases that we suffer from. So we have to manage our inflammatory response. And that means changing how we eat, when we eat, what we eat, as well as how we behave, how we exercise, and all the rest of it.
Yeah, I'm not sure I went from Bobby Kennedy to lab-grown meat, but as we're on the conversation, I just had to bring it in. Coming up to the kind of closing section now, we talked about the hope and optimism around Bobby coming in and some of the key priorities. You're out in the US on tour with your book. Tell us a little about the book and what you hope that it will achieve in conjunction to Bobby coming into office.
Yeah, so Jonathan E. Maud have co-written this book. We were going to be on George Norrie, one of the biggest overnight radio programs, syndicated, has a huge audience, several million. And Jonathan's been on there 29 times. This is going to be his 30th time. He says, Rob, George wants us on to talk about Bobby Kennedy and what's going to happen with MAHA, but we don't have a book. And the interview was going to be in something like a week's time. So he looked at me, maybe we can do 20, 30 pages or something and just have something that we can communicate. So we looked at each other across the Atlantic, and we wrote in about 3.5, 4 days the MAHA mandate, reversing America's chronic disease epidemic.
Wow.
So we put it together very, very quickly, but between his legal understanding and my scientific understanding, it wasn't a huge task. But first thing we wanted to do is really show people the reasons why Bobby Kennedy is the right guy for the job. He's a very unique character. One of the things we've always known about him is first of all, he does not change his position. He doesn't need it for the sake of money. He can't be bought. He's very principled. He really cares about human beings. And he understands the relationship between humans and their natural environment. He's been as concerned about, the fish in the Hudson River as he has been about children and their school lunches, etc. So, and their vaccines, dare I say. So, his ability to also stand up against authority is pretty unusual. So it's one of the reasons he said after he'd been nominated by Trump as Secretary of HHS, he said to anyone who was going to be contrary to what he was planning to do to expose corruption, he said, pack your bags and get out. So we start the book looking at that. We then look at the process of tyranny, the rise of the administrative state. You've got to remember, about 75% of all legislative decisions that impact how society runs are actually made by bureaucracies And these are made by the administrative state without any congressional oversight. So essentially, these bureaucracies have grown and grown and grown, and you've got a whole battery of people who are involved through revolving doors with the megalith of different agencies that have been established, and the largest, the most expensive agencies are related to human health, which is why HHS chews up a quarter of the entire U.S. federal budget. So and food and drugs are a huge part of that, which is why the system. And I think we'd all be happy if all of that money was being used and Americans were really, really healthy.
A picture of health. And thanks to Bobby, he's a picture of health.
Well, he is.
I see him banging out his push-ups and pull-ups. He's a machine.
Exactly, totally.
Yeah.
So we look at tyranny. We then deconstruct the American health crisis, the epidemic, the chronic disease epidemic, to really help people to understand it's not to do with a lack of drugs. It's not even just single foods. This is to do with a structure. It's a complete. The public health system does not work. The public health system, as we mentioned earlier, done some great job, some time back in terms of being able to provide potable drinking water for the public, having decent sewage systems, but it's kind of moved into this realm where it's gives dietary advice, it gives vaccination advice, and those things aren't really saving lives. In fact, they probably are contributing to significant ill health, or they're just making certain special interests very, very wealthy, but they're not working for the benefit of the people. So we expose all of that, and then the latter parts of the book really are looking at how we fix this system. And so we really look at this revolution that can go on. We have a very comprehensive range of strategies. Some of which we put in the public domain. I'll give you one example. If you use, Jonathan happens to be one of the leading constitutional lawyers in the US. You should read his 2021 book, The Authoritarians, his 2007 book, The Rise of Tyranny. These are two great books that show what's going on in the United States. But he helped write some of the language in the FDA Modernization Act that basically said nutrient disease statements. These are quite important because nutrient disease statements are pieces of information that people use to be able to take a nutrient to be able to combat or protect themselves against a disease. But if a government makes those statements, authoritative statements, it shouldn't need to go through another test to be able to qualify about whether you can make it. If a government makes it, it's looked at the science through its massive bureaucracy of people who are looking at the science, and then they publish that. What should stop, someone coming along and selling that food with that same statement on it? If the government can make the statement, why can't it relate to the food? So that's the reason that the clause in the FDA Modernization Act, Jonathan wrote that in, it should be able to escape the requirement for going through a test of significant scientific agreement, which is essentially when the FDA developed the qualified health claims regime, which is another pay-to-play system that hardly anyone can get into. So we've now tracked how many of these authoritative statements have been made by the US government. And it's quite astonishing. There is over 350 of them. So imagine this, 350 statements that the government knows about nutrients that can combat some of the most important killer disease in the US. But if you're a commercial player selling a food to the public, you can't make it.
Right.
So under the First Amendment and free speech, hey, why can't you? So a couple of things that happened. In the middle of last year, Chevron doctrine, so this is a doctrine that's existed since 1984, that basically was a case that the Natural Resources Defense Council took against Chevron, the petroleum company, around pollution. But it basically gave deference to the agencies, in this case the EPA, if there was ambiguity in a statute. And that essentially, since 1984, has created this massive overreach in government agencies across the board. So the FDA, the EPA, CDC, they all use this. They basically say, an ambiguous statute, we will take the most precautious measure that, restricts your ability from getting the good stuff or poisons you with the bad stuff to benefit special interests that we're working with through our revolving doors. That's how it's happened since the 1980s. The Supreme Court, in the Loper-Bright case, mid-2024, 28th of June 2024, overturned Chevron doctrine. So game on.
Okay.
So when we started working on this and developing this and seeing how many cases, Jonathan thought maybe there'll be 30, 40 of these authoritative statements. Well, we found 350 of them.
Madness.
And at that stage, we did not realize, we had no idea that Bobby Kennedy might come into play. So we were planning to sue the FDA over this. Now, as of today, as of an hour ago, we're going to petition. We're not going to sue. We're going to petition Bobby Kennedy and say, look, under the First Amendment and the fact that Chevron no longer applies, the government has all this information it knows about how people can get healthy by taking nutrients instead of drugs. You see, they've created a carve-out to specifically exclude foods being treated in a similar way to drugs. And this could blow that whole regime apart.
Wow.
So that's one of our starting processes. We have a legal challenge we already have initiated against the homeopathy ban that came in. FDA, again, through the administrative procedure, changed its guidance in December 2022 and essentially banned all over-the-counter homeopathic medicines overnight. And the reason they did that is because a lot of people in COVID were using homeopathy.
Yeah, of course they were. Yeah.
So we've initiated a challenge. We're now going to go back to Kennedy and say, how about, a settlement on this? We will have a friend in a very high place to try and move things forward without the massive expense of a battle in the courtroom, but into a common sense approach about what works for the people. So we've documented 9 different key strategies. We have about another 15 strategies we're working with, but we need to go for it really hard early on, because as the inertia builds, there will be a system that will be trying to stop Bobby Kennedy at every turn.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, this is my sentiment. I think right now, I think people that hope, the two sides of the coin, hopium or despair. If you go to the extremes on either side, you get apathy and you get disillusionment, disenfranchisement, you get withdrawal. Right now, there is hope and optimism. And I think that hope and optimism has to be coupled with action on behalf of the consumer, because there is no better time than now to push for what is right. Yeah. And this is not a time to sit back. This is a time to double down. This is it. This is it. We've got to take that shot. We've got to take that chance.
We will never get this chance again.
Not in the same way.
No, I'm pretty sure of that.
It's a unique position. Yeah. However, I want to close with this question, because despite all of that hope, being realistic, there is going to be barriers, as we've talked about. The machine is going to try and slow down the progress. So flipping the equation back to the individual at home, what are 3 of the most important things that human beings, for their own well-being, can do right now to break free from these litany of health challenges that the human race is facing?
I think the very first step is to stop treating government as mummy and daddy. Essentially what's happened in the development of a nanny state is a situation where there is so much distrust of your intuitive decisions, your own experience, the guidance that's come through generations, your grandparents' wisdom. All of that has been lost because we're meant to be focusing on what the institutions tell us. And, that's even happened within the medical profession. The family physician, the general practitioner, the role in the community has been massively diluted. Why? Because the average GP is looking over their shoulder at what their medical board is saying, or what the overriding health agency is saying about what they can or can't say. So that has to stop. So step number 1 is to be empowered. You have to be empowered. And the way in which you be empowered is to reestablish trust in the systems that are trustworthy. And government, we've seen all the evidence of it around the world, and I don't think it's changing, in terms of many people's perception, even of the Trump administration. It's very early days. Trust of governments is not where your trust should lie. You're much better off looking at your communities, looking at in terms of health. There are all sorts of organizations around. Obviously, the ones who get targeted by the system are worth looking at because, generally speaking, they're trying to upset the apple cart. So becoming empowered and removing your trust from governments, I think, is one of the most important things to do. The second thing is engage in behaviors that are healthy. And, we are essentially the product of our behavior and our genetic expression. And our genetic expression is controlled by the way we interact in the environment. So, if we can start putting more good stuff into our bodies and put less bad stuff and understand where the good stuff is. I mean, eating in restaurants all the time, we've seen in many countries now, people are eating more food out than they are in. And you can't control what's going into restaurant foods. Even the ingredients list in ultra-processed foods don't tell you everything there is to know about the food because, the high temperatures of extruded savory snacks, for example, that represent a very significant portion of the total caloric intake of children these days, completely changes the nutrient profile of what's in that food. So you look at the ingredients, but these things have been subjected to more than 200 degrees centigrade, and chemicals like acrylamide, which is a known carcinogen, are now formed, but they were formed in the manufacturing process, so they don't have to be on the label. So eat foods that, are ones that you recognize as much as possible. And go back to some of the, I shouldn't even use the word back, go forward to a process where we start doing things that we know are good for us. And, eating around a dining table, with some nice music in a good environment. If you use heart rate variability, for example, as your metric to see how you are responding to stress, that's a pretty useful thing to do. You can use a fancy watch to measure your HRV, but we've got to manage our stress response, and we have to consume food in an unstressed state in order to be able to extract the goodies from that food. Be kind to one another. We've got to stop hating things. We've got to become less polarized. We've got to find more common ground with each other. And the reality is that, we became so polarized during the COVID environment that suited a system that wanted to control us. If we want to be empowered, we need to stop hating people who think on 1, 2, or 3 issues differently from us. Yeah. And we've got to understand where we share things in common with each other. So, I mean, that's just a starting point.
Yeah.
But
it's a whole separate discussion in itself.
And trust in nature. I mean, nature, I regard nature as our ultimate teacher. And so learn from nature what's going on. And, it's not that nature doesn't do cruel things to itself, but it does it with grace. So if you look at a rainforest, I mean, it's pretty interesting what's happening in there, but it's not just beautiful because it happens accidentally to look beautiful. It's because when you sacrifice yourself as a herbivore to that carnivore, you do it in the knowledge that those nutrients are going to be recycled and going to support the next generation. So this give and take, we've got to become less selfish, and we've got to become more giving, understanding the reason why we're here. We've got to address our higher needs, the deeper purpose of what it is to be human. And in fact, all the science is beginning to show that very clearly. One of the most important things that we can do is have purpose in life. And that means doing something that goes beyond ourselves, our own immediate needs. So, and that's just a starting point.
Rob, that's fantastic. The book you mentioned, is that just for the senators, or can people,
no,
be publicly available?
No, we have books in print, the easiest way of getting it is through an ebook. And if you go to mahamandatebook.com, you can purchase at a very reasonable price the ebook. There's a lot of information in
description.
Yep. Thank you. You can go to our website. We're also selling hard copies if people want to. Just go to anh-usa.org for our US organization, or aninternational.org to contact us if you want a hard copy.
Amazing. And they can also find out about your great work on those websites as well.
They can indeed. Yeah.
Rob, it's been a pleasure as always. What a time to be here. What a time to be alive. What a time to be speaking the day that Bobby Kennedy takes on his new role. Lots of hope and optimism and lots of problems to get to work on. And for the message you at home, please do continue to take action. This is a great time for us to now galvanize together and actually pursue a healthier future, leveraging organizations like the Alliance for Natural Health for wisdom and guidance. Now is time to push for a healthier future for us all, but also to take that personal action into our own lives so we can actually become healthy role models for others around us. So please let us know what you thought about today's discussion. Leave us a comment below. And if you would like to hear more about this subject, about how we can optimize our health, please also let us know. And if you want to take the next step on the journey with us here on the podcast, help us to break through the censorship. We've talked about some subjects today that may be challenged by big tech. Then please join our supporter community over at danastin-gregory.com/supporter, where you'll get early access to all of our interviews, behind the scenes insights, and lots more, and plug into a wonderful community of free thinkers. So thanks again for tuning in. We've been today here with Rob Verkerk at the Alliance for Natural Health. It's been a beautiful conversation, and I look forward to seeing you again very soon.
Thank you, Dan.
Over and out.
The fight for health sovereignty is on, and Bobby Kennedy's appointment represents a potential once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. But as we've heard today, change starts with us. And the more that we educate, empower, and take responsibility for our own health, the harder it becomes for the system to control us. So please check out the most important links from today's discussion in the description. Plus, if you found value in this conversation, you'll also see a link to how you can support our work by joining our private membership community, where you'll get ad-free episodes, exclusive bonus content and behind-the-scenes insights, and direct access to our private community of free thinkers. You can join now at danastin-gregory.com/supporter and be part of the movement. If you enjoyed this episode with Dr. Rob Verkerk, please hit like, subscribe, and do share it with someone who needs to hear this. The future of health is in our hands. Thanks once again for tuning in. We'll see you in the next episode of the Dan Astin-Gregory podcast.